What would you do if you could take out money from an ATM that wasn't yours? Not just a few bucks, but thousands of dollars, over and over again. No PIN changes, no hacks, just a loophole so invisible that the bank didn't even notice.
Living the life of a high roller, lavish dining, private jets, expensive gifts for friends, and it didn't cost him 1 cent.
This is the story of Dan Saunders, a man who found a glitch in an ATM system and used it to live out every fantasy the rest of us can only dream of. Private planes, VIP clubs, champagne showers, the life that many of us would live if we had millions of dollars. But like every banking era, this dream lifestyle didn't last forever. This story begins with Dan Saunders being an average 29-year-old bartender in Wangaratta, Australia, a small town nestled in Victoria's countryside. Most nights he served drinks. Most days he paid bills. His life was modest, predictable, and honestly, kind of dull. But one Friday night in 2011, everything changed. One night after a late shift, Dan went drinking with a friend. When his friend left and Dan went to pay for another round, he noticed that his wallet was empty. So drunk and desperate, he stumbled into the night searching for an ATM machine. At 12:10 a.m., he found one, a National Australia Bank machine. He inserted his credit card, already nearly maxed out with a $1,995 balance against a $2,000 limit. He still tried to transfer $200 to his savings account, and of course the ATM spat out an error. But something didn't add up. When he inserted his savings card to double check, the screen read, "Balance unavailable." So Dan, despite being drunk, was curious and attempted a $200 withdrawal anyway. And to his surprise, the ATM gave him the cash. It was like the bank was asleep, and Dan had just found the keys to the vault. That glitch should have been impossible, but the machine didn't care, so Dan tried again. First $400, then $800, and every time, the ATM handed over cash. That night, before Dan went home, he withdrew $2,000, despite both his accounts being in the red. The next morning, to make sure what happened last night was not a dream, Dan checked his bank balance as soon as he got out of bed. His credit card was still minus $1,995. His savings? Zero. Where had the money come from? But a day later, the savings account updated, negative $2,000. The system had finally caught up, but nowhere on his statement did it show the source of the transfer. It was as if the ATM had invented the money from thin air. And of course, Dan knew it was wrong. He knew it was debt, but he kept the money, bought a fridge, took friends out drinking, and gambled the last $300 and lost it all. But Dan wasn't just reckless. He was curious. He replayed the night in his mind and realized something. The glitch happened after midnight. A few nights later, Dan tried again. Same ATM, same steps. And it still worked. Every night between midnight and 1 a.m., the ATM seemed to disconnect from the central banking system during routine maintenance. And that's when Dan would act. He'd transfer money from his overdrawn credit card to his empty savings. The ATM would reject the transfer, but the savings account would still update, allowing him to withdraw the full amount. The catch: the glitch only lasted a few hours. By the following morning, the system would correct itself, turning whatever he withdrew into debt. So Dan created a cycle: withdraw $2,000. The next night, transfer $4,000. Withdraw $2,000. The next, transfer $6,000. As long as he played the game every night, his accounts never triggered the bank's automatic red flags. And so, every night between 12 and 1 a.m., Dan was a ghost in the banking system. It started small, a few grand, then $20,000, then $50,000. Within weeks, Dan had pulled out over $100,000, and he didn't just hoard it, but he spent it like a king. He booked luxury hotels, treated friends to 5-star meals, flew in helicopters, bought designer clothes, and rented entire hotel floors for parties. For his friends, he paid off their student loans, flew them around Australia, and even rented an island in Indonesia for 2 days. He even paid strangers' debts and handed out cash to homeless people, convincing himself that he was some modern-day Robin Hood. As for his job as a bartender, his boss eventually fired him after it became known of the high amounts of money Dan would gamble every week, which led to his boss and some people getting some suspicion of Dan partaking in some illegal activity. To questions about the source of his sudden wealth, he claimed the money came from the money he won from his bets on the horse race track, but no one really knew. By now, he was operating at a $500,000 illusion, and the temptation to see how far he could go overwhelmed the fear of being caught. He wasn't stealing in the traditional sense, no weapons, no hacking, just numbers, just timing, but it was theft, and Dan knew it. For 4 months, Dan lived like a millionaire, but with every withdrawal, the pressure built. Guilt, anxiety, the fear that one day someone would notice, or when he missed one night, everything would unravel. And eventually, it did. He stopped. Made one final withdrawal, gave money to his friends, then let the accounts crash after he couldn't stomach the guilt any longer. Then the bank called. They noticed the 1.6 million Australian dollars deficit. But Dan played dumb, and of course they warned him that he'd be investigated. But then, silence. Weeks passed, then months. Dan waited in his hotel room, certain the police would knock any moment. But nothing happened. For 2 years he lived in limbo. No job, no future, and no justice. So tired of living in constant fear of being arrested, Dan went public. He told his story to an Australian newspaper, then appeared on the TV show, A Current Affair. They filmed his lifestyle, helicopters, hotel suites, champagne, but then turned on him. On the night the show aired, the host declared Dan a wanted fugitive, and the next day, producers lured him to the studio with promises of paperwork. But when he arrived, a friend of the show, who was a police officer, arrested him while on camera. But here's the twist. The bank had never filed charges. The arrest was pure theater, built from the show's narrative, not the justice system. The case only went to court because of Dan's televised confession, and even then, the bank refused to testify. Therefore, this resulted in Dan Saunders only being sentenced to 12 months in jail. So Dan Saunders never denied what he did. He never tried to run. He openly admits the guilt, the thrill, and the pain. Whether you see him as a criminal, a folk hero, or a cautionary tale, one thing's certain. He found a flaw in the system, and for 4 months, he broke reality. The full amount Dan stole may never be known up to this day. He claims it was $1.6 million. It could have been more. We'll never know, because the bank never wanted the truth exposed. Because sometimes the real crime isn't what gets reported, it's what gets buried.